There are some crimes so vile that even history refuses to remember them. This is one of them. In the winter of 1887, Scotland Yard locked away a file that would stay hidden for nearly a century. Inside, the names of 7 dead, their faces frozen in twisted laughter, and the kind of details that make even seasoned detectives lose sleep. These weren't street killings in the rookeries of Whitechapel. These were murders in Belgravia, London's fortress of wealth, where gaslight glowed against white stucco mansions, and the elite believed their doors, their titles, and their money kept death away. They were wrong. Every victim bore the same mark carved into the skin just above the heart, a theatre mask, half comedy, half tragedy, and every victim's home was said to echo with laughter hours after the coroner had already confirmed they were dead. This was not madness without method. This was performance. A killer staging his work like an artist on the grandest stage, choosing an audience not in the stalls of a West End theatre, but in the marble parlours of London's most powerful families. The case would destroy reputations, consume one of Scotland Yard's most respected detectives, and expose how deep the rot of influence and secrecy ran in the highest circles of Victorian society. For this wasn't just about murder, it was about who was allowed to commit it without consequence. The public never knew the truth. They were told only what kept the machine of empire running smoothly, but behind closed doors the whispers never stopped. Those who worked the case spoke of chemical scents that lingered in the air, of bodies arranged like saints, of the sound of mirth that wasn't human, and they spoke of a man, if he was a man, whose laughter could follow you home. What you're about to hear is dangerous. Once you know, you can't unknow. This isn't the kind of story you leave behind. When the video ends, it changes you, because it forces you to look at power and see the face it hides. It's time you met the Laughing Man. London, 1887. The empire was at its peak, half the world painted in red on the maps that hung in schoolrooms and government halls. Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee had just paraded through the streets, a spectacle of pageantry meant to prove that Britain's crown was eternal. Belgravia sat at the city's heart like a jewel, rows of white stucco townhouses arranged with mathematical precision, iron balconies gleaming in the pale light, garden squares trimmed as neatly as a military parade. This was not London's chaos. This was its control. The streets here were paved with money, every address a fortress of influence. By day, the district moved like a well-oiled machine. Carriages bearing politicians, industrialists and merchants rolled past gas lamps that stood like silent sentinels. Servants in liveries kept the sidewalks immaculate, sweeping away the grime before it had a chance to touch the polished boots of their employers. But by night, Belgravia changed. The same gas lamps threw their light in small, weak pools, leaving long corridors of shadow between them. The fog crept in from the Thames, thick enough to turn familiar streets into mazes. You could lose your bearings in seconds, and sometimes voices seemed to come from nowhere, laughing, whispering, before fading back into the mist. Inspector Edmund Harwick knew these streets well. He was the kind of man you trusted to find the truth, not because he was polite, but because he was relentless. A blacksmith's son who'd worked his way up from constable to detective, Harwick understood both sides of London, the polished world of drawing rooms and the filthy reality of the alleys behind them. He walked with quiet authority, and the men who worked under him knew he saw details they didn't. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the next 8 months would be his undoing. The Laughing Man would not just take lives, he would take Harwick's certainty in the order of the world, and if you think this is only about a killer, you're wrong. The deeper you follow this trail, the more you'll see that the murders were only the mask. The real performance was what happened behind the curtains, where London's elite made sure the truth never reached the stage. October 15th, 1887. The fog rolled in heavy that night, thick, wet and yellowed by coal smoke. It was the kind of fog Londoners called a pea souper, the kind that could make you lose sight of your own doorstep. In Belgravia, it crept between the railings and wrapped itself around the lamp posts like something alive. Lady Margaret Harrington's carriage moved at a crawl through the murk, the driver calling out warnings to invisible traffic ahead. She had left the Royal Opera House early, using a headache as her excuse. In truth, the evening's endless performance and polite conversation had worn her patience thin. She wanted her home, her fire, her quiet. When the cab turned into Belgrave Square, she noticed it instantly. Her front door was open, not wide, but just enough to spill a rectangle of warm light into the fog. It was wrong. Her head housekeeper, Mrs. Elenina Whitfield, had been with the family for over 2 decades. She was as precise as a clock, doors locked at 10 sharp every night. Lady Margaret climbed the steps, her silk slippers damp on the stone, and called out softly into the hall. The fog seemed to swallow her voice. The gaslight inside flickered with the night air, casting restless shadows along the marble floor and the gilt-framed portraits. Then she saw her. Mrs. Whitfield lay in the drawing room, her silver hair fanned around her head in a perfect halo, her hands folded neatly over her chest. But her face, God help her, her face was locked in the most radiant, genuine laughter Lady Margaret had ever seen. It was joy so vivid it felt like mockery, like something that had no place in death. The room told another story. Chairs overturned, curtains torn down, a shattered vase. A struggle had happened here, violent, desperate, and yet, when it ended, someone had taken the time to arrange the body, to sculpt the scene. That was when Lady Margaret realized something else. The laughter wasn't just on Mrs. Whitfield's face. Somewhere in the house, faint but clear, she could still hear it. Inspector Edmund Harwick arrived just as the first grey light of dawn began to bleed into the fog. His long overcoat was beaded with moisture, his bowler hat pulled low against the chill. He stepped inside without ceremony, his eyes sweeping the room like a surgeon examining an open wound. Mrs. Whitfield's body was unlike anything he had seen in 25 years of police work. Her face glowed with that impossible expression, pure, unrestrained joy. Yet her neck bore the dark bruises of strangulation, and her nails were broken, flecked with skin not her own. The contradictions made his jaw tighten. He knelt beside her, gloved hands steady, and saw it. Just below her collarbone, cut into the flesh with delicate precision, was a small mask. Half smiling, half weeping. The comedy and tragedy of the stage, carved into cold skin. The wound was shallow, deliberate, not an act of rage, a signature. Harwick stood slowly, scanning the wreckage of the room. Every overturned chair, every shattered ornament told a story of violence, but also of something else. This wasn't the chaos of a thief or a drunkard. It had been directed. The body, the hair, the hands, arranged with care. The work of someone who wanted this scene remembered. And then there was the smell. Not the sourness of death, but something sweet, almost chemical. It caught in his throat. Harwick had encountered it once before, during a case involving a disgraced surgeon at Bethlehem Royal Hospital. An odor that spoke of anesthetics and experimentation, of someone who understood how to bend the human body to their will. "Sir," Constable Thornbury's voice wavered. The young officer stood at the far side of the room, pale and sweating. "Listen." Harwick held still. Somewhere upstairs, faint but distinct, came the sound of laughter. Not cruel, not mad, joyful, human. And yet Mrs. Whitfield had been dead for at least 6 hours. The inspector's eyes darkened. Whatever this was, it was not over. By afternoon, the fog had lifted enough for Harwick to walk the square. He went door to door, speaking to the neighbours with the kind of quiet persistence that made people answer even when they didn't want to. Most claimed they had heard nothing unusual, but when Harwick reached the Pembroke residence directly across from the Harrington home, Mrs. Gertrude Pembroke hesitated before answering. A matronly widow with sharp eyes, she ushered him into her sitting room and lowered her voice. "I was awake past 2, she said, tea cooling on the table between them. "Insomnia. I was reading when I heard it. Laughter. A woman's laughter. Not drunken, not forced. Real, full of life. coming from the Harrington house. Harrick's gaze narrowed. And you're certain it was after midnight? Inspector, it was after 2, and I saw your men arrive well before that. The statement was impossible, yet it matched what Lady Margaret herself had felt. A sense that the laughter had lingered long after death. Back at the Harrington home, Harwick ordered the scene combed inch by inch. He found faint traces of powder on the carpet, a fine dust that tested by the crude methods available as a mixture of ether and something else he couldn't identify. Whatever it was, it had been deliberately introduced into the room, not to kill, but to do something else. The coroner's report gave little comfort. Mrs. Whitfield had died of asphyxiation, but with no signs of struggle beyond the initial bruising. No broken bones, no torn muscles. It was as if her resistance had stopped, as if she had surrendered willingly in those final seconds. That night, Harrick filed his preliminary report, but when he delivered it to his superior, Superintendent Aldous Greaves, the older man read in silence, then closed the folder with deliberate slowness. Inspector, Greaves said, voice like gravel. Pursue this case. Carefully. Belgravia is sensitive. People here have influence, connections. We don't want to make trouble where none is needed. Harrick heard what wasn't said. Someone wanted this handled quietly. Someone wanted limits placed before the truth could take shape, and that told him more than any piece of evidence so far. The laughing man hadn't just taken a life. He had entered the home of the powerful and left untouched. It happened 12 days later, November 27th, 1887. The Cavendish family's Chester Square residence was known for its intimate salons, nights of music, art and theatre, attended by the sharpest minds and deepest pockets in London. That night was no different. Lamps burned bright, champagne glasses clinked, and somewhere beyond the laughter of the guests, the laughing man slipped inside. By morning, Geoffrey Cavendish, the youngest of the family, a patron of the arts, was found in his study. His valet discovered him seated at his desk, pen in hand, as though interrupted mid-letter. The scene was immaculate, no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, only the smell, sweet, layered, chemical, and that same impossible smile. The mask was there again, carved with surgical precision into the skin above his heart, and this time, something new, a small folded program from the Royal Theatre placed neatly in his breast pocket. Harrick opened it carefully. One play was circled in pencil, The Mask of Fools. A satire about powerful men blinded by their own vanity, led to ruin by a figure who mocks them from the shadows. Neighbours reported nothing unusual, except one. A footman from the house across the square swore he heard applause in the middle of the night. Not one person clapping, but a crowd. Harwick stood in the Cavendish study long after the body had been removed, staring at the chair where Geoffrey sat. This was no random strike. The laughing man had chosen his victim with care, and his stage with purpose. The mask, the playbill, the perfect smile, they were part of a performance that was unfolding in acts. Back at Scotland Yard, Harrick laid the photographs from both murders side by side. 2 different homes, 2 different victims, but the same careful staging, the same chemical scent, the same carving, and both victims belonged to Belgravia's new industrial aristocracy, the men and women who had made fortunes from the empire's factories, ships, and trade. It was then that Harrick realized something chilling. The laughing man wasn't killing at random, he was selecting his audience. And the message wasn't meant for the public, it was meant for the people who believed themselves untouchable. The third came faster. December 3rd, 1887, less than a week after the Cavendish murder. The victim was Sir Lionel Westcott, a shipping magnate whose wealth came from opium routes the government preferred not to discuss. His townhouse in Eaton Place was a fortress of polished brass and guarded gates. Yet sometime between the hour his butler left him with a nightcap and the moment the maid entered to draw the morning curtains, the laughing man had come and gone. Sir Lionel was found in his armchair, head tilted back, smiling so serenely it seemed almost painted. A tumbler of brandy rested on the table beside him, untouched. Across his lap lay a folded sheet of fine stationery, the ink still fresh, bearing only 4 words. "The curtain will fall." The mask was there again, etched just above the heart, but this time Harik found something else, a single golden cufflink on the carpet. Not Westcott's, his was silver. Harik pocketed it, already feeling the weight of its significance. He had it examined by a discreet jeweler. The design was unusual, a laurel wreath surrounding a small theatre mask, not the public emblem of any club or society he knew, but the craftsmanship spoke of money. Old money. The jeweler swore he had seen the design once before, at a private auction attended only by titled families and industrial lords. Harik returned to Scotland Yard ready to press this lead, but was met at the door by Superintendent Greaves. The older man's face was tight. "The Westcott case," he said, "will be handled quietly, effective immediately. Your involvement is concluded." "On whose order?" Harik asked. "From above." That was all. No explanation, no appeal, just the iron wall of authority closing in. Harik didn't need to ask what above meant. It was the same people who moved in the highest salons, who sat on boards and in Parliament, who could make files appear and men vanish without a ripple. People who were beginning to fear the laughing man, but feared his exposure even more. And yet later that night, as Harik sat alone in his rooms, he took the golden cufflink from his pocket and turned it in his hand. He knew now that the killer moved in the same rarefied air as his victims, and someone in that circle, someone with power, was ensuring the curtain stayed up. But every performance, no matter how grand, has its final act. By the next morning, Harik knew the only way forward was without permission. If Greaves was closing the door, he would find another way in. The cufflink was his key. He began in the least official place possible, the basement archives of St. James's Gazette. Reporters, unlike the Yard, didn't fear offending the powerful, at least not all of them. Harik found what he needed in a stack of society pages, brittle and yellowed. There, tucked between notices of charity galas and opera openings, was a photograph from 3 years earlier, a private gathering at the Hanover Club. In the picture, a half-dozen men stood in black tie, holding crystal flutes. One of them, a tall, lean figure with a smirk that seemed more private joke than smile, wore a pair of gold cufflinks, laurel wreaths, theatre masks, the same as the one in Harik's pocket. The caption named him Lord Alistair Pennington, known patron of the arts, heir to a coal fortune, and, if rumour was to be believed, a man whose amusements occasionally slid into cruelty. But Harik's instincts told him this wasn't just a matter of one suspect. He'd heard whispers over the years of something older, a circle of the wealthy who met not in clubs or parlours, but in hidden rooms, where the entertainment was not for the faint of heart, men and women bound together by secrets so dangerous that the threat of exposure alone kept them loyal. That night, Harik followed Pennington. From the theatre to a dinner in Mayfair, then to a house on a quiet street in Knightsbridge. No lights in the windows, no carriages waiting, just a single knock, a pause, and the door opening to admit him. Harik crossed the street and studied the facade. It was just another townhouse to anyone passing by. But the moment the door closed, faint strains of music drifted out, violins, slow and haunting, and then, unmistakably, the sound of laughter. Not polite laughter, not social laughter, the kind that slid down the spine. It was then Harik realized he might be standing outside the laughing man's true theatre, and that inside were not just suspects, but an audience who paid to watch the performance unfold. He stepped back into the shadows, knowing one thing with certainty. If he went through that door, the case would stop being a matter of law and become a matter of survival. It took Harik 3 nights to find his way inside. A borrowed uniform from a discreet contact at the catering staff, a forged list of deliveries, and a willingness to risk being thrown into the Thames if things went wrong. On the night of December the 9th, 1887, he approached the same Knightsbridge townhouse wearing a porter's coat and carrying a crate of wine. The doorman glanced at the list, grunted, and waved him through. The air inside was warm, perfumed with tobacco and expensive liquor. The entry hall was lit by crystal chandeliers, but what drew Harrick's eye was the masked guests, half a dozen men and women in silks and evening coats, faces hidden behind elaborate half-masks of gold, ivory and jet. Their laughter floated through the corridors like the scent of decay under flowers. In the main room, the curtains were drawn tight. A string quartet played slow, deliberate music in the corner. The guests sat in a loose semicircle facing a small raised stage. On it stood a man in a black cloak, reading from a script in a voice that dripped with mockery. His subject, thinly veiled caricatures of the city's most powerful industrialists, portrayed as fools and grotesques. The audience roared with approval. But Harrick's gaze kept returning to the walls. Lining them were framed sketches, charcoal renderings of human faces, all wearing the same impossible smile carved into the laughing man's victims. The detail was too precise to be coincidence. One sketch in particular made Harrick's blood run cold. It was of Geoffrey Cavendish, the second victim, drawn before his murder, if the date in the corner was to be believed. He moved carefully through the room, pretending to tend to the wine, listening. The name Pennington surfaced more than once, spoken in tones of amused respect, but there was another name, whispered like a half-joke, half-warning, the director. When Harwick slipped out later that night, heart pounding, he knew two things for certain. The laughing man's killings were not random. They were part of a performance designed for an audience that met in secret, an audience that knew the victims before the bodies were found. And somewhere among them, perhaps sitting on that stage or in the shadows beyond it, was the director who wrote the script. The next step was clear: find the director. But in a society built on secrecy, the more he looked, the more he risked being seen. Harrick started with the sketches. He returned to the Gazette archives and traced the artist's style through exhibition pamphlets. It was a dead end, none were attributed, and the handwriting on the dates had been deliberately altered. But one pamphlet, from a private art show at the Hanover Club, listed anonymous works provided by a patron under the name D. The trail took him back to Pennington. Harwick shadowed him again, this time through fog-choked alleys behind Covent Garden, where Pennington slipped into a dim back entrance of the Royal Theatre. Harwick followed minutes later, climbing narrow service stairs until he reached the rafters above the stage. Below, in the dim light, a rehearsal was taking place, but it was unlike any he'd seen. The actors were masked, their lines distorted into cruel, exaggerated mimicry of real public figures, and seated in the center of the stalls was a single man in an immaculate black suit, his face pale against the shadows. The director. He never spoke above a murmur, but every movement of his hand altered the scene, a gesture for more laughter, a pause to let a cruel line sink in, a nod of approval at an especially vicious portrayal. The actors seemed to orbit him like planets around a sun. Harwick couldn't see his face clearly, but the aura was unmistakable. This was a man used to command, not request. And when the rehearsal ended, the director stood, removed his gloves, and slipped on a pair of golden cufflinks identical to the one Harwick carried. The urge to follow was almost overwhelming, but Harwick held back. The director was surrounded by two men who moved like guards, their eyes sweeping every corner. Instead, Harwick retreated the way he'd come, down into the night air, clutching the beam for balance as the theatre's laughter echoed in his ears. For the first time he felt the noose tightening, not around the killer, but around himself. Because the laughing man wasn't just a murderer, he was an actor in a play the director had been writing for years, and Harwick was about to be given a part. It began with the letter. A single envelope hand-delivered to Harwick's desk at the Yard with no return address. The paper was thick, the kind favoured by private clubs, and on the back was the faint impression of a theatre mask pressed into the wax seal. Inside was a sheet of cream stationery, neatly folded. No signature, no salutation, just 12 words written in an elegant flowing hand. "We have written your entrance. You will take the stage tomorrow." There was no threat, no demand, but Harwick understood it instantly. The director was telling him plainly that the game was moving into its final act, and Harwick had been cast. He spent that night pacing his apartment, turning the cufflink over in his fingers, like a coin he was afraid to spend. He thought about the sketches, the victims, the laughter that followed each death. This wasn't random killing, it was choreography, and now he was the next scene. The next day, he noticed them. Two men, different from the usual tales, but trained. One on the opposite pavement as he left the yard, the other seated in the far corner of the cafe where he took his lunch. Not police, not journalists. By evening, his flat had been entered. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, but on his desk sat a mask. Not one of the elaborate golden ones from the townhouse, but a simple white half-mask, plain as a stage prop. Inside it, folded small, was another note: dress accordingly. It was no longer a matter of investigation. Harwick could feel the frame closing around him. The director was building something, a final performance, and every choice Harwick made now was part of it. He knew one truth, heavy as a stone in his chest. The only way to catch the laughing man was to step willingly into the director's play. And once he did, there would be no way to walk back off the stage. The instructions arrived just before dusk. A carriage would be waiting at the corner of Warwick Street at 8 sharp. No address given, no choice in the matter. Harwick wore the plain half-mask, as instructed, under a heavy overcoat. In his pocket, the small revolver felt almost absurd against what he was walking into, like a toy weapon in a war fought with shadows. At precisely 8, the carriage appeared. The driver said nothing as Harwick climbed in. The streets blurred past, twisting deeper into London's labyrinth until they reached an unmarked iron gate. Two men in black coats opened it without a word, and the carriage rolled into darkness. When the door opened, Harwick stepped out into a courtyard lit only by a circle of gas lamps. Beyond it loomed an old building, windowless, its brickwork blackened by decades of soot. The air smelled faintly of dust and grease paint. Inside, the sound of murmured voices drew him toward a vast theatre space. But the seats were not filled with the public. These were the masked patrons he had seen before, seated in perfect rows, their faces catching the light in fragments of gold, ivory, and jet. The stage was bare, save for a single chair in the center. "Inspector Harwick," a voice called from the shadows of the wings, smooth, controlled. "Welcome." The director stepped into the light, the same black suit, the same pale face. He carried no script, yet it was clear every word had been rehearsed. "You've chased our jester across the city," the director said. "Now, you will understand his art." Harwick said nothing, keeping his eyes locked on him. The director gestured, and from the opposite wing the laughing man emerged, masked, gloved, moving with an almost theatrical grace. In his hand was a long, slender knife, gleaming under the footlights. The audience leaned forward as one. "This," the director continued, "is the final act. You may play the hunter or the fool. The choice, Inspector, is yours." The room held its breath. Somewhere high in the rafters, a clock began to tick. And Harwick realized the performance had already started. The stage felt impossibly wide. Every step Harwick took toward the chair echoed in the stillness. The laughing man circled him slowly, the knife catching thin slices of lamplight. From the seats, a ripple of amusement, soft, knowing laughter, rolled through the masked audience. It was the same sound he had heard after every murder. The director stood just off stage, arms folded, watching like a man inspecting the final stroke of a painting. "You've chased shadows," the laughing man said, his voice muffled by the mask, "but you never looked behind you." Harwick kept his hands loose at his sides, though every nerve was coiled tight. "Take off the mask." The laughing man tilted his head as if considering it. "Why would I spoil their fun?" He nodded toward the audience, and a wave of polite clapping filled the theater. Harwick could feel the trap tightening. This wasn't a duel, it was a script. The knife, the stage, the silent watchers, they'd rehearsed every moment but his, and that was his only advantage. He feigned a glance at the director, drawing the laughing man's eyes for a fraction of a second. Then he moved. His hand shot to his coat pocket, the revolver clearing the fabric just as the laughing man lunged. The knife's edge scraped his sleeve, a whisper of steel against cloth, before Harrick slammed into him, sending them both crashing into the chair. The audience roared, not with fear but with delight. They clapped as if the violence was part of the performance. Some even stood, leaning forward, eager for the final blow. The laughing man writhed, kicking, the mask slipping to reveal only a sliver of a jawline, pale, almost elegant. Harrick tried to pin him, but the man twisted free, knife flashing again. "End it," the director's voice cut through the air. It wasn't clear if he spoke to Harrick or his killer. The audience went silent, and Harrick knew that in the next breath, the final act would be decided. The gaslights dimmed, leaving only the pool of illumination on Harrick and the laughing man. The rest of the theatre dissolved into a black void, the audience's masks now floating like disembodied faces in the dark. The laughing man's breathing was sharp and controlled, the knife steady in his hand. Harrick's revolver was raised, but his finger rested motionless on the trigger. "Shoot him," the director said softly, as if coaxing a nervous actor. The laughing man chuckled. "You think it ends with me? It ends when the curtain falls, and not before." The director's voice sharpened. "The scene, Inspector." Harrick felt the weight of the room pressing in. The audience wasn't here for justice. They were here for an ending. They didn't care which man fell, only that the fall was spectacular. He remembered the victims, each death carefully staged, each laugh perfectly timed. This wasn't about murder, it was about control, a performance so complete that even the hunter danced to the director's cues. The laughing man lunged again, the knife arcing toward Harrick's throat. Instinct took over. He sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist, twisting hard until the blade clattered to the stage. The crowd gasped, then erupted into applause. For the briefest second, Harwick saw an opening. The mask had shifted, revealing more of the man's face. Sharp cheekbones, a small scar near the mouth. Not a stranger. Someone he'd seen in police files years ago. Someone who was supposed to be dead. The recognition jolted him. The laughing man used the distraction to wrench free, scrambling for the knife. And in that split second, Harrick made his choice. The gunshot cracked like thunder in the theatre. The laughing man froze mid-motion, then collapsed, the mask rolling across the stage. Silence. Then, slowly, the audience rose to their feet, clapping in perfect unison. The director stepped forward, smiling faintly. "Bravo, Inspector. A flawless performance." But the way he said it made Harwick's skin crawl, because in his tone was the certainty that the play wasn't over. The applause went on too long. It wasn't the messy, uneven clapping of a real audience. It was mechanical, synchronized, like the ticking of a giant clock. Each sound was perfectly spaced, perfectly timed. The director walked to the center of the stage, stepping over the laughing man's body as if it were part of the set. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, projecting to the farthest corner of the darkness, "our tale concludes. A hunter triumphs, a fool falls. And yet," he looked at Harrick, his pale eyes glinting, "the world beyond these walls will never know." Harrick kept his revolver raised. "You're under arrest." The director smiled as if he'd been waiting for that line. "You think I'm here, Inspector, but I've been gone since the first act." A sharp hiss of gas filled the air. Harwick's throat tightened. The audience stood perfectly still, their masks now reflecting the flickering light as the shadows began to swell unnaturally along the walls. Somewhere above, hidden machinery groaned. A panel in the stage floor slid open, revealing a staircase leading down into pure darkness. Two masked figures emerged, moving toward the body of the laughing man. Without ceremony, they lifted him and carried him below. "Where are they taking him?" Harrick demanded. "To his dressing room," the director said with a smirk. "Every actor deserves a rest before the next performance." Harrick's finger tightened on the trigger, but then the director simply stepped backward, melting into the shadows until his outline dissolved entirely. The gas thickened. The clapping grew louder, more fevered, echoing in Harwick's skull. He stumbled, vision swimming. The masked faces leaned closer, their applause now sounding like bone striking bone. And then, darkness. When he woke, he was in his flat. alone. His revolver was gone. On his desk lay a single ticket, dated for the following Friday night. The venue was listed only as the theatre without a name. The curtain had not fallen, it had only paused. For 3 days, Harwick kept the ticket locked in a desk drawer. He told himself it was evidence, proof of what had happened, proof he hadn't imagined it. But the ticket was warm when he touched it, as if it had been resting in someone's hand only moments before. On the 4th night, he started hearing the applause again, not from outside, there was no one in the street, but inside his own walls. It came from behind the plaster, from under the floorboards, from inside the pipes, steady, perfectly timed. He began checking his doors twice, then 3 times. He slept with the light on. Still, the sound followed. By the 6th night, it wasn't just clapping. A low chuckle threaded through it, the same chuckle he'd heard from the laughing man. That was when he noticed the envelope on his kitchen table, heavy, sealed in black wax. He hadn't left it there. Inside was a photograph. Harwick, taken from behind, standing in his flat's window. In the reflection of the glass, he could see a figure in the street, a tall man wearing a white mask, holding a bouquet of theatre programs. On the back of the photograph was a message in looping theatrical script. "You were magnificent, Inspector. The next act begins soon." That night, the ticket in his desk was gone, and in its place, 2